Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson I'm going to show you another data workflow of taking a data table that has x and y coordinates and turning it into proper spatial data as an actual point layer. This is a really common workflow when you get data from a GPS or sometimes when you get data from different services. So in this case we're going to be working with that same US cities data layer that we worked with before a couple lessons ago when we learned just how an edit session works and we moved the cities around and created a new city and that kind of thing. But we're starting with it as a data table in this case, and we can take a look at the data. It's just a text file right now, and we can see all the attributes as a comma separated values file. So every comma delimits a new field, and each row below it is a new row in the attribute table, and each comma positionally delimits which field it is. So this is the object ID field, this is the cities x020 field, this is the feature field, this is the name field, and so on. We can make this a little easier to look at because Microsoft Excel can open this natively, and we'll talk about we talk about CSV files or comma separated value files pretty regularly. We talk about CSV files or comma separated value files pretty regularly. You'll start to hear about them a lot more in the data analysis work, and it parses them and looks a little more like an attribute table we're used to. At the end here we can see the latitude and the longitude fields that we can use to turn this into a spatial data set. So if I close this table here and I bring up ArcMap, and I'll go to add data, and I'll find that data layer there, that CSV file, and it's uscities.csv, and I'll double click it to add it. And note again that since I have a table in my table of contents now, and as opposed to features, it's list by source because there's no rendering order for that, so it can't display here. So it's showing it to me here, and I can open the attribute table and see it just like we did before. So it parsed the CSV file correctly for us. And if I want to turn this into spatial data now, notice that it didn't automatically figure out that these x and y coordinates were x and y coordinates and plot them on the map. I have to tell it what's going on here. So close that back out. And what we're going to use is we're going to use something called display XY data. And there's also a geoprocessing tool for that called make XY event layer. So I can search for that over here. Make XY event layer. And I can bring up that geoprocessing tool. Now in this case we're not going to do it this way. We're going to close that out and we'll do it with the right click method and go to display XY data. And in this case it is pretty smart, and so I choose the table from the map, and we already did that when we opened it up, and then we can specify X, Y, and even Z fields for 3D information, and it knows that if it uses the word longitude, that means it's an X field. So longitude being the vertical lines going around the Earth, right? That's X in an XY coordinate system. And then latitude is the Y field. So it populates those in for me, but I would need to confirm this. Don't just trust what it puts in here. Make sure that it makes sense, because if you don't get this right, your data is going to be in all the wrong places on the map. And then I also need to set the coordinate system. In this case, it put in the WGS 1984 coordinate system that the data is in, but let's just go through the process as if it didn't. So I would need to click edit and find the correct coordinate system in here and scroll to it, expand any given areas, and then select it from the list. And in a moment I'll show you what it looks like when we do that wrong. So once I get all these parameters right, so choose the correct X field, choose the correct Y field, and choose the coordinate system that those X and Y data represent, and then I'll click OK. And it's warning me right now that the table is going to be restricted because it doesn't have an object ID field. And so I won't be able to do things like selections on it until after I export the data. So I'm going to go ahead with that and click OK. And I get this new layer called uscities.csv events. And for those of you thinking about the object ID field, it does have an object ID field, but ArcMap doesn't know it's an object ID field because we didn't bring in a structured data table. So it wasn't stored in a database management system as a table, so it doesn't know that it's an object ID field. That's just an integer field to it. So it's going to have to add its own when we export it. And now the cities appear. They're really hard to see, but they're there. But let's make this bigger so we can see them better. And there we go. The cities appeared on our map based upon the X and Y data in our table here. So that's how you take a table with X and Y data, with latitude and longitude data, and turn it into a spatial data feature. Now, when we're done, we need to make this permanent. So this just exists in our map document almost as if we'd had a selection that we made into a new layer. So we'd want to publish it to a permanent data set on the disk and name it as US cities from table. So I'll click OK. And now it's going to add that object ID field to the data for me. And I'll add it to the map. And what I might want to do in this case, since I now have a new object ID field, is I might want to delete the old one. And I'd want to make sure which one's the old one by going to properties and seeing the type. So this one is of type object ID, and the old field named object ID is of type long. So I could right click on it and delete the field to clean it up so it's not confusing which one's the actual object ID. And now let's just take a quick moment and take a look at that limited functionality that this event layer has versus the permanent layer. So if I try to do a selection on it, I can't select anything. And that's because it doesn't understand the object ID. But if I turn on these other layers that we just created, I can create that selection now. Because when it's exported permanently, it has an object ID field and it needs that in order to do things like selections. Now, finally, before we wrap this up, let's remove these two others here. And let's do this one more time, but let's select the wrong coordinate system. So we'll leave the longitude and latitude set, but let's select some other geographic coordinate system here, or some other projected coordinate system even. Let's say we thought it was in UTM for some reason, which these coordinates don't match UTM, but we thought it was in a WGS84 version of UTM. And I happen to know that this area is in zone 10. So let's try that. And I'll click OK. And OK. And it's warning me about the object ID field again. Click OK. And I don't see any data here again. Let's just change the symbology to make sure it's not just hiding. And I still don't see any data. So where is it? Well, let's zoom to layer and find out. And it looks like it's drawing the world probably somewhere in the middle of some ocean here, or the US somewhere in the middle of some ocean here. And it's zoomed way in because those coordinates are really small in this UTM zone here. So when we get data misalignment like that, that tells us that we selected the wrong coordinate system for this data, and we need to go look at whatever metadata came with it, or if we created the data off of a GPS, we need to go figure out what coordinate system the data is actually in and specify it correctly during the display XY data phase here. So that's it for this lesson. In this lesson, I showed you how to take a data table that has X and Y data in it, but that isn't a spatial layer on its own, and turn it into a spatial data set. I also showed you how to deal with some common problems, including not being able to create selections because you hadn't exported it and created an object ID field, and what happens when you select the wrong coordinate system. This is a really useful and basic workflow common to a lot of GIS systems, so I hope it helps you out. See you next time.